Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Discovery watching the stars through the main screen. The year was 2157, and humanity had finally cracked the secret of faster-than-light travel. 12 human colonies now existed beyond Earth, and Jake felt proud to be exploring even further into the unknown regions of space. His ship was not the biggest or strongest in the human fleet, but it was fast and had the best crew he could ask for. The Discovery had been traveling for 3 weeks toward the Kepler 442 system when the sensors started going crazy. Commander Lisa Hayes, his second-in-command, rushed to his side with a worried look on her face. The readings showed massive energy signatures approaching from the outer system, and they were moving fast toward the human ship. Jake ordered red alert and told his crew to prepare for anything. What appeared on their screens was beyond anything humans had ever seen. 50 massive ships emerged from hyperspace around them, and each vessel was at least 10 times larger than the Discovery. The alien ships had smooth curves and gleaming metal hulls that seemed to shimmer with their own light. Energy patterns danced across their surfaces, and Jake realized these beings had technology that made human achievements look like Stone Age tools. Communication signal came through their systems, and the main screen flickered to life. The face that appeared was not human, but clearly intelligent. The being had pale blue skin and large dark eyes that seemed to look right through Jake. When it spoke, the words came through in perfect English, which meant these aliens had been watching humanity for some time. Admiral Vextar of the Zephyrian Empire looked at the primitive human vessel with obvious disgust. He had been monitoring this species for several months and found them to be barely above the level of animals. Their ships used crude chemical rockets for basic flight, and their weapons were simple projectile systems that could barely scratch Zephyrian armor. The humans had no energy shields, no quantum computers, and no telepathic abilities whatsoever. The Admiral began speaking in a voice that carried absolute authority. He told Jake that humanity had entered Zephyrian space without permission, and this was considered an act of war. However, the Zephyrian Empire was merciful to lesser species and would offer the humans a choice. Earth and all human colonies could surrender completely and become workers for the Empire, or the Zephyrian fleet would destroy every human settlement in the galaxy. Jake felt his blood run cold as he listened to the aliens' demands. The Admiral explained that humans would be perfect as manual laborers, since they were strong enough for heavy work, but too primitive to cause any real problems. Human colonies would mine resources and build structures for their Zephyrian masters, while the most intelligent humans might be allowed to maintain basic equipment under careful supervision. Commander Hayes stepped forward and asked how long humanity had to consider this offer. Admiral Vextar smiled, which was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. He told them that Earth had exactly 72 hours to broadcast their complete surrender, or the Zephyrian War fleet would begin destroying human worlds one by one until nothing remained. The alien transmission ended, and Jake found himself staring at empty space filled with massive enemy ships. His communications officer, Lieutenant Danny Rodriguez, managed to establish a secure channel back to Earth, and Jake immediately sent word of what had happened. The message would take several hours to reach home even at light speed, but there was nothing else they could do except wait and watch the alien fleet back on Earth. President Nathan Cross received the emergency transmission while meeting with congressional leaders about next year's colonial budget. Within minutes, he had called an emergency session of the Global Defense Council, and every major world leader was connected by quantum communication links. The news of first contact should have been humanity's greatest moment, but instead it might be announcing their doom. Dr. Amanda Foster, head of the Terra Research Institute, was the first to speak after Jake's message finished playing. She had spent her career studying theoretical alien contact scenarios, but none of her research had prepared humanity for this situation. The Zephyrians clearly had technology that was hundreds or perhaps thousands of years ahead of human science, and their demands left no room for negotiation. General Marcus Bell, commander of Earth's combined military forces, reviewed the numbers, and they were not encouraging. Humanity had managed to build exactly 212 starships over the past 30 years, and most of those were designed for exploration or cargo transport rather than warfare. Against 10,000 Zephyrian vessels, Earth's fleet would last maybe an hour in direct combat. The president asked if there were any options besides surrender or destruction. Chief Engineer Ryan Burke raised his hand and suggested something that made the others pause. He pointed out that the Zephyrians had conquered many species over thousands of years, but they had done so using the same methods every time. They relied on overwhelming technological superiority, and the fear it created in their enemies. Burke explained that humans were different from other species in ways the aliens might not understand. Where other races thought in logical patterns and accepted defeat when the odds were impossible, humans had a history of doing the unexpected. Every major human achievement from flight to space travel had been accomplished by people who refused to accept that something was impossible, Doctor. Foster nodded and added that human psychology was unique among known intelligent species. Humans had evolved as persistence hunters who could track prey for days without giving up. They had survived ice ages and natural disasters by adapting and finding new solutions when old methods failed. Most importantly, humans had never achieved the kind of unified planetary government that other species seemed to develop naturally. This meant that human thinking was chaotic and unpredictable compared to the orderly minds that dominated most galactic civilizations. Where aliens saw problems and calculated solutions, humans saw problems and invented entirely new approaches. The Zephyrians had probably never encountered a species that would choose to fight, rather than submit when defeat seemed certain. President Cross asked General Bell to begin immediate preparations for what might be humanity's last stand. Every available ship would be recalled to defend Earth, and the outer colonies would be evacuated if possible. Dr. Foster's research teams would work around the clock to find any weakness in Zephyrian technology, while Burke's engineers tried to upgrade human weapons and defenses. Meanwhile, Captain Morrison and the Discovery remained hidden in the asteroid field of the Kepler system, watching the Zephyrian fleet. Commander Hayes noticed that the alien ships seemed to follow very precise formation patterns, and their patrol routes never varied. Lisa realized that such perfect order might actually be a weakness if humans could find a way to exploit it. The countdown had begun, and humanity had less than 3 days to find a miracle or face extinction. But Jake Morrison looked at his crew and saw something the Zephyrians had missed in their calculations. He saw determination burning in human eyes and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that had carried his species from caves to the stars. The aliens had made their first mistake by giving humans time to think and plan. The galaxy was about to learn that underestimating humanity could be a fatal error. Emperor Kethmore sat on his crystal throne in the capital city of Zephyr Prime, surrounded by the gleaming towers that had stood for over 3,000 years. The Zephyrian High Council had gathered in the Great Chamber to discuss the human situation, but the Emperor found the entire matter boring beyond belief. In his long reign, he had overseen the conquest of 47 different species, and the humans appeared to be among the most primitive he had ever encountered. The intelligence reports spread across his desk made for disappointing reading. Humans still used chemical combustion for atmospheric flight, which was technology the Zephyrians had abandoned over 2 millennia ago. Their space vessels were tiny, cramped things that could barely house a dozen crew members, while Zephyrian ships carried thousands. Human weapons fired solid projectiles or simple energy beams that could not even penetrate basic. Zephyrian shielding Counselor Merthak approached the throne with additional data about human society and culture. The reports showed that humans had not even achieved proper planetary unity, and were still divided into hundreds of separate nations that frequently fought each other. They had different languages, religions, and political systems, which made them chaotic and inefficient compared to the perfect order of Zephyrian civilization. What the Emperor and his council failed to understand was that this apparent weakness was actually humanity's greatest strength. The Zephyrians had evolved from a species of hive-minded insects that naturally formed organized hierarchies. Their ancestors had never needed to develop individual creativity or independent thinking, because the collective mind solved all problems through shared intelligence. Humans had taken a completely different evolutionary path. They descended from pack hunters who survived by working together while maintaining individual personalities and skills. Human tribes succeeded because different members could think of different solutions to the same problem. Where Zephyrians saw chaos, humans saw diversity of thought and approach on Earth. Colonel Danny Rodriguez had been chosen to lead a dangerous scouting mission back to the Kepler system. His job was to get close enough to the Zephyrian fleet to gather detailed information about their capabilities without being detected. Rodriguez had volunteered for what everyone knew was likely a suicide mission, but he believed the data might give humanity a fighting chance using a modified stealth probe Rodriguez managed to get within scanning range of the alien fleet. What he discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The Zephyrian ships were indeed incredibly advanced with energy systems that produced more power than entire human cities. Their weapons could probably destroy Earth's moon with a single shot, and their shields could deflect anything in the human arsenal. However, Rodriguez noticed something interesting about how the aliens operated their vessels. Each ship followed exactly the same patrol pattern at precisely the same intervals. When one vessel moved, the others adjusted their positions according to what appeared to be a predetermined formula. The entire fleet functioned like a single organism with no individual initiative or creative thinking. The alien crews were also much smaller than expected. Ships that could hold thousands of beings were operated by only a few dozen Zephyrians. Everything else was automated by computers that followed rigid programming. Rodriguez realized that the Zephyrians had become so dependent on their technology that they had lost the ability to improvise or adapt when something unexpected occurred. Back on Earth, Dr. Katie Sullivan was making an even more important discovery in her neuroscience laboratory. She had been studying human brain chemistry to understand why humans were so different from other known intelligent species. Her research revealed that human minds produced unique combinations of neurotransmitters that created what she called cognitive chaos, where other species developed logical thought patterns that followed predictable paths. Human brains constantly generated random connections and unexpected associations. This was why humans were so good at creative problem solving, and why they often came up with solutions that more logical minds would never consider. It was also why human behavior seemed so unpredictable to outside observers. Dr. Sullivan's most shocking discovery was that this mental chaos made humans naturally immune to telepathic influence. The few Zephyrian telepaths who had tried to read human minds during previous first contact situations had reported that human thoughts appeared as meaningless noise. What they were actually encountering was a form of mental static that made human minds unreadable to alien telepaths. This meant that one of the Zephyrians' most powerful weapons would be completely useless against humanity. They could not break human will through mental domination or extract strategic information through telepathic interrogation. For the first time in their history, the Zephyrians would face an enemy whose thoughts and intentions remained completely hidden. Emperor Kethmore remained unaware of these developments, as he made the decision that would doom his empire. Rather than sending the full Zephyrian war fleet to crush humanity, he decided that a small enforcement squadron would be more than sufficient. 50 ships under the command of Admiral Zektha would travel to Earth and demonstrate Zephyrian power by destroying a few human colonies. The Emperor believed this show of force would convince the humans to surrender, without requiring a full military campaign. After all, every other species had submitted once they witnessed Zephyrian technology in action. There was no reason to expect these primitive humans to behave any differently from the dozens of races that had fallen before them. Admiral Zektha accepted his orders with the casual confidence that came from never having experienced military defeat. He had participated in 12 conquest campaigns, and each one had followed the same pattern. The Zephyrian fleet would arrive in enemy space, demonstrate their overwhelming superiority, and wait for the inevitable surrender. Usually the entire process took less than a week. The Admiral selected his most experienced captains for the mission, including Commander Veltok, who had overseen the subjugation of the Altaran Federation, and Captain Mordex, who had broken the resistance of the Crystal Worlds. These veterans had never encountered an enemy that could seriously threaten Zephyrian forces, and they expected the human campaign to be their easiest victory. Yet, as the Zephyrian enforcement fleet prepared to depart, none of them considered that they might be walking into a trap. Their intelligence reports confirmed that humans had weak technology, limited numbers, and no experience with interstellar warfare. The idea that such primitive beings could pose any threat to the mighty Zephyrian Empire seemed laughable. Commander Hayes aboard the Discovery had been monitoring Zephyrian communications and noticed increased activity around their main fleet. She reported to Captain Morrison that the aliens appeared to be preparing a smaller force for immediate deployment. This was actually good news because it meant humanity would not have to face the entire Zephyrian armada in their first battle. Morrison realized that the aliens were making the same mistake that more advanced civilizations had made throughout human history. They were assuming that technological superiority guaranteed victory without considering the human factors of determination, adaptability, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The Zephyrians were about to learn what the British had discovered at Lexington and Concord. The alien enforcement fleet jumped to hyperspace, heading toward Earth with complete confidence in their inevitable victory. Admiral Zekta expected to return home within days with news of humanity's surrender, and another successful conquest to add to the glory of the Zephyrian Empire. Instead, he was about to encounter something that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. Humanity had been given 72 hours to surrender, but they had used that time to prepare for war in ways the Zephyrians could never have imagined. The galaxy was about to witness what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable object and discovered that humans had never learned the meaning of the word impossible. Captain Morrison received urgent orders from Earth Command to return immediately with all intelligence gathered about Zephyrian capabilities. The Discovery made the jump to hyperspace and arrived at Earth just as Admiral Zekta's enforcement fleet was detected on the outer edge of the solar system. The aliens had arrived exactly 72 hours after their ultimatum, which showed they were precise and predictable in their operations. General Bell had assembled every available human warship in Earth orbit, but the sight was both inspiring and terrifying. 212 vessels hung in space, representing the entire military might of humanity. Yet they looked like toys compared to the 50 massive Zephyrian ships approaching from the outer system. Each alien vessel was large enough to carry the entire human fleet in its cargo bays. Colonel Sam Watson had been assigned as military advisor to Captain Morrison, based on his experience with unconventional warfare tactics. Watson had studied every human military victory against superior forces from David and Goliath to the Vietnam War. His conclusion was that humans could only win by refusing to fight the kind of battle their enemies expected. The traditional approach would be to form a defensive line around Earth and meet the Zephyrian fleet in a conventional space battle. This was exactly what Admiral Zekta anticipated, and his ships were perfectly designed to win such an engagement. Watson proposed something completely different that violated every principle of civilized warfare but might actually work against an enemy who had never faced desperate humans. The human fleet would split into dozens of small groups that appeared to be fleeing in panic toward different parts of the solar system. This would look like exactly what the Zephyrians expected from primitive beings who realized they were outmatched. The alien fleet would pursue these groups, confident in their ability to capture or destroy scattered human forces. Lieutenant Commander Beth Palmer's engineering teams had spent the past 3 days retrofitting human vessels with modifications that no sane military would ever consider. Cargo ships were loaded with explosive materials and fitted with remote control systems. Passenger liners had their life support systems replaced with additional fuel tanks. Even civilian pleasure craft were turned into potential weapons. The first part of Watson's plan required convincing acting that would have impressed professional entertainers. When the Zephyrian fleet entered the inner solar system, they found the human defense force exactly where they expected it to be. The formation looked desperate and poorly organized, with ships positioned randomly around Earth's orbital space. Admiral Zekta opened communication channels and offered humanity one final chance to surrender. President Cross responded with defiant words about human dignity and independence that made the alien commander shake his head in disgust. These primitive beings clearly did not understand the hopelessness of their situation, but they would learn. Soon enough, the Zephyrian fleet advanced in perfect formation with energy weapons charging and shields at maximum power. Their tactical computers calculated that the engagement would last approximately 17 minutes before all human resistance was eliminated. What happened next would be discussed in military academies for the next 1,000 years. As soon as the alien ships came within weapons range, the human fleet began what appeared to be a complete retreat. Ships broke formation and scattered in all directions with their engines running at maximum power. Some vessels appeared to be heading for the outer planets, while others dove toward the sun in what looked like desperate attempts to escape. Admiral Zekta ordered his ships to pursue and capture as many humans as possible for interrogation and forced labor. The Zephyrian vessels split into hunting groups and chased after the fleeing enemy with confident precision. Their shields remained at reduced power since human weapons could not possibly threaten Zephyrian armor, and their crews prepared boarding parties to take prisoners. This was exactly what Colonel Watson had planned for. As Zephyrian ships closed in on apparently helpless human vessels, the first surprise was revealed. Captain Morrison's group suddenly reversed course and accelerated directly toward their pursuers with engines overloading and hulls glowing from the heat of maximum burn. The Zephyrian commander had 3 seconds to realize that humans were willing to use ramming attacks before the Discovery smashed into his ship's engine section. The collision destroyed both vessels, but the explosion took out 2 more Zephyrian ships that had been following too closely. Admiral Zektha watched in horror as primitive humans chose to die rather than surrender. Lieutenant Commander Palmer's second group revealed the next phase of human insanity. Her ships had been modified to carry magnetic mines that were so simple and crude that Zephyrian sensors dismissed them as debris. These mines attached themselves to alien hulls using basic magnetism and then detonated nuclear charges that cracked. Even Zephyrian armor pilot officer Tony Martinez led the most audacious attack of all. His squadron of modified fighters was too small for Zephyrian weapon systems to target effectively, but large enough to carry devastating payloads. The fighters approached through asteroid fields, where their tiny signatures were lost among the space rocks and natural debris. Martinez's pilots had trained for suicide missions, and every one of them knew they would not be returning home. They flew directly into Zephyrian engine intakes and detonated themselves inside the alien power systems. The resulting explosions sent cascading failures through Zephyrian ships as their own energy turned against them. Dr. Helen Brooks monitored the battle from Earth Command and watched as human forces eliminated 15 Zephyrian vessels in the first 10 minutes of combat. The aliens had expected a quick victory against primitive opponents, but instead found themselves facing enemies who fought like cornered animals with nothing left to lose. Admiral Zektha tried to restore order to his fleet but discovered that Zephyrian tactical doctrine had no provisions for dealing with suicidal enemies. His computers could not calculate effective responses to ramming attacks because no civilized species had ever used such tactics. The idea of deliberately sacrificing ships and crews to damage the enemy was completely outside Zephyrian understanding. The human attacks continued with increasing desperation and creativity. Cargo ships released their entire loads of industrial materials that acted like massive shotgun blasts when they hit Zephyrian shields. Passenger liners used their emergency systems to create electromagnetic pulses that disrupted alien sensors. Even small civilian craft managed to cause damage by using their reactors as improvised bombs. Commander Hayes had taken command of a mixed group of military and civilian vessels after Morrison's sacrifice. She led them in attacks that seemed to come from everywhere at once as human ships popped out of asteroid fields, debris clouds, and even planetary atmospheres to strike at Zephyrian forces before disappearing again. The aliens found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to follow any logical patterns. Just when they thought they understood human tactics, the humans would try something completely different. Zephyrian computers crashed trying to process combat data that made no sense according to established military theory after 2 hours of chaotic battle. Admiral Zektha realized that his enforcement fleet had been reduced to 35 ships while the humans still had over 100 vessels in action. More importantly, the alien crews were beginning to show signs of psychological stress as they faced an enemy that seemed to welcome death if it meant taking Zephyrians with them. The Admiral made the decision to withdraw and regroup at a safe distance. His ships pulled back to the outer solar system, while human forces continued to harass them with hit-and-run attacks. For the first time in Zephyrian military history, a conquest fleet had been forced to retreat by a technologically inferior enemy admiral. Zektha's report to Emperor Kethmore would change everything. He described human tactics as chaotic, illogical, and impossibly primitive, but also terrifyingly effective. The humans fought without regard for their own survival and used methods that no civilized species would ever consider. They turned their own weakness into strength and made their desperation into a weapon. The Emperor's response was predictable, but exactly what Colonel Watson had hoped for. Rather than trying to understand human psychology or developing new tactics to counter unconventional warfare, the Zephyrians decided to use overwhelming force. The next wave would consist of 200 ships with enough firepower to crack planet's humanity. Had won their first victory, but the cost had been terrible. Captain Morrison and dozens of other brave souls had given their lives to prove that humans would never submit to alien rule. Dr. Brooks calculated that Earth's fleet now numbered fewer than 150 ships against an empire that could send thousands. However, something important had changed in the past few hours. Word of humanity's resistance was already spreading through Zephyrian space as news of the defeat reached other conquered species. For the first time in millennia, vassal races were beginning to wonder if the mighty Zephyrian Empire might not be as invincible as everyone believed. The galaxy was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one with nothing left to lose. News of Admiral Zektha's defeat spread through the Zephyrian Empire like wildfire, causing the first cracks in a civilization that had never questioned its own superiority. On dozens of conquered worlds, vassal species began asking questions that had not been spoken aloud for centuries. If primitive humans could defeat Zephyrian forces, what did that say about the Empire's claims of invincibility? Emperor Kethmore found himself facing pressure from the High Council for the first time in his reign. Councillor Murthak demanded immediate action to crush the human rebellion before other species began following their example. The Emperor's authority depended on maintaining the belief that Zephyrian technology made resistance hopeless. Fleet Admiral Mordax was summoned to the Imperial Palace and given command of the largest military force assembled in over 1,000 years. 200 of the Empire's most powerful warships would travel to human space, carrying planet-cracking weapons and siege equipment designed to eliminate entire civilizations. There would be no negotiations and no mercy for the species that dared to defy. Zephyrian Rule the Admiral was a veteran of 15 conquest campaigns and had personally overseen the destruction of 7 rebellious worlds. His reputation for ruthless efficiency had earned him the nickname Deathbringer among vassal species, and even his own crews feared his cold determination. Mordax viewed the human situation as a minor irritation that would be resolved through the application of overwhelming force. However, humanity had not been idle during the weeks since their first victory. Engineer Casey Thompson led research teams that studied every piece of Zephyrian technology recovered from the battle. Rather than trying to copy alien systems, the humans focused on understanding their weaknesses and finding ways to exploit them. Thompson discovered that Zephyrian technology was incredibly sophisticated, but also highly integrated and predictable. Their ships used quantum computers that processed information at impossible speeds, but followed rigid programming that never varied. Energy systems were perfectly efficient, but vulnerable to cascade failures if the wrong components were damaged at precisely the right moment. Dr. Amanda Foster's teams made an even more important discovery about Zephyrian psychology. The aliens had evolved from hive-minded creatures that valued order and conformity above all else. Their entire civilization was built on the principle that there was one correct solution to every problem, and superior technology would always triumph over inferior force. This meant that Zephyrians could not adapt when faced with situations outside their experience. They would keep using the same tactics even when those methods failed, because their minds could not accept that chaotic primitive thinking might be superior to logical advanced reasoning. Humanity's apparent weakness was actually their greatest strength. General Bell received reports that the new Zephyrian fleet was heading toward the human colony of New Dallas rather than Earth itself. Admiral Mordax had chosen this target because destroying an outer settlement would demonstrate imperial power while giving humans one final chance to surrender before Earth faced the same fate. Captain Laura Mitchell commanded the defense forces at New Dallas and received orders that seemed insane, even by recent human standards. Rather than trying to defend the colony, she was to evacuate all civilians and turn the planet itself into a weapon. The plan required precise timing and nerves of steel, but it might be the only way to stop a force that could crack worlds. Mitchell. His teams worked around the clock to place geological charges at critical points across the planet's surface. These explosives would trigger massive seismic events that could destabilize the entire planetary crust if detonated in the correct sequence. The idea of destroying their own world to deny it to the enemy was something only humans would consider. When Admiral Mordax arrived at New Dallas, he found exactly what he expected. The human colony appeared to be abandoned with no ships in orbit and no defensive installations visible on the surface. Clearly, the primitive colonists had fled in terror when they learned of his approach. This was the natural reaction of inferior beings faced with superior force. The Zephyrian fleet moved into orbit and began preparing to establish a permanent occupation base. Their plan was to use New Dallas as a staging area for the final assault on Earth, while broadcasting images of the conquered world to break human morale. Mordax expected this demonstration to convince humanity that continued resistance was hopeless. Instead, the humans triggered the largest artificial earthquake in galactic history. Captain Mitchell detonated the geological charges in a sequence that sent shock waves through the planet's core, causing massive volcanic eruptions and continent-spanning fault lines. Within minutes, New Dallas was transformed from a peaceful agricultural world into a hellscape of lava and poisonous gases. The planetary destruction created debris clouds that extended far into space, disrupting Zephyrian sensors and navigation systems. Volcanic ash and electromagnetic interference from the seismic activity made it impossible for the alien fleet to maintain formation or coordinate their movements effectively. In the chaos that followed, Commander Pete Johnson led a fleet of converted civilian vessels in attacks that the Zephyrians never saw coming. His ships included cargo haulers, mining platforms, and construction vessels that had been retrofitted with industrial equipment turned into weapons. The aliens had dismissed these craft as non-combatants, but they carried firepower that could cripple warships. Johnson's mining ships used their ore processing lasers to cut through Zephyrian armor, while construction drones swarmed over alien hulls like mechanical parasites. Cargo vessels released their loads directly into Zephyrian engines, causing massive explosions that tore the huge ships apart from within. Every civilian craft became a weapon of war. The Zephyrians found themselves under attack by enemies they had not even considered threats. Their computer systems classified the destruction of their ships as industrial accidents and equipment malfunctions because the idea of using civilian technology as military weapons was outside their programming parameters. Admiral Mordax watched in disbelief as his carefully planned operation turned into complete disaster. 63 of his ships had been destroyed or disabled by what appeared to be random accidents and system failures. The humans were fighting with tools and methods that made no sense. According to any military doctrine he had studied, the worst part was the psychological impact of facing an enemy that seemed to enjoy destroying themselves if it meant taking Zephyrians with them. Human pilots laughed over communication channels as they flew their ships into alien vessels. Human crews sang songs while their reactors overloaded. The humans acted like they were having fun while dying. Commander Hayes had assumed overall command of human forces after being promoted to admiral following her heroic actions in the first battle. She coordinated the New Dallas operation from a command ship hidden in the asteroid belt where Zephyrian sensors could not detect her. Through all the planetary debris, Hayes realized that the key to defeating the Zephyrians was not matching their technology, but exploiting their psychological weaknesses. The aliens expected logical, predictable responses to their attacks, but humans specialized in doing the unexpected. Every time the Zephyrians thought they understood human tactics, the humans would try something completely different. The battle around New Dallas lasted for 18 hours and ended with Admiral Mordax ordering a full retreat. His remaining ships pulled back to safe distance, while human forces continued to harass them with hit-and-run attacks launched from the debris field of their own destroyed world. The Admiral's report to Emperor Kethmore was even more disturbing than Zektha's had been. These humans fought like rabid animals with no regard for logic or self-preservation. They used impossible tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare and seemed to view their own deaths as victories if they could damage Zephyrian forces more. Importantly, the human resistance was inspiring rebellions throughout the Empire. On 17 different worlds, vassal species had begun refusing orders and demanding independence. The mighty Zephyrian Empire was facing the first serious challenge to its authority. In over 3,000 years, Emperor Kethmore realized that the human problem could no longer be solved with limited military action. The very foundations of imperial power were being threatened by the example these primitive beings had set. If word spread that humans could defeat Zephyrian fleets, the entire galactic order might collapse. The Emperor made the decision that would either restore imperial dominance or destroy his civilization completely. The full might of the Zephyrian war machine would be brought to bear against humanity. 8,000 ships carrying world-destroying weapons would end the human threat once and for all. But the Emperor had made the same mistake as his admirals. He assumed that superior technology and overwhelming numbers would guarantee victory without understanding that humans had spent their entire evolutionary history proving that determination could overcome any odds. The stage was set for the final battle that would decide the fate of both species and determine whether the galaxy would remain under Zephyrian rule or enter a new age where freedom was possible for all intelligent beings. Emperor Kethmore's decision to commit the entire Imperial fleet to destroying humanity sent shockwaves throughout Zephyrian space. 8,000 warships representing the accumulated military might of 3 millennia began converging on the Sol system, carrying enough firepower to reduce planets to cosmic dust. This would be the largest military operation in galactic history, and its outcome would determine the future of every species in known space. The mobilization could not be hidden from the vassal worlds that supplied resources and labor to maintain the Zephyrian Machina. On 43 different planets, subjugated species watched the massive fleet preparations and realized that their masters were scared enough of primitive humans to risk everything on one final battle. If the mighty empire needed such overwhelming force to crush a single world, maybe the Zephyrians were not as invincible as they claimed. Rebellions began erupting across the galaxy as species that had accepted Zephyrian rule for centuries suddenly found the courage to resist. The Alteran Federation declared independence and began attacking Imperial supply lines. The Crystal World stopped shipping rare minerals essential for Zephyrian technology. Even the peaceful Mentari started sabotaging the factories that produced weapons for the Imperial fleet. President Cross addressed the human fleet from the bridge of the newly constructed flagship UES Defiance. Every surviving ship from Earth's colonies had returned to defend the homeworld, and volunteers from across human space had brought whatever vessels they could find. The final human armada numbered barely 200 ships against an enemy force that outnumbered them 40-1. Admiral Jake Morrison had been promoted to overall fleet command after his heroic sacrifice at the first battle had somehow been survived when his escape pod was recovered from the wreckage. He worked closely with Dr. Amanda, Foster's research teams, and General Bell's strategic planners to develop humanity's most audacious plan yet. The strategy they created was so insane that it could only have been conceived by humans facing impossible odds. Rather than trying to fight the Zephyrian fleet, they would attempt to capture it, using a combination of computer viruses, psychological warfare, and the element of complete surprise. Humanity would try to turn the alien armada against its self-programmer. Alan Parker had spent months developing viruses specifically designed to exploit the rigid programming of Zephyrian computer systems. These programs would not destroy alien technology, but instead introduce random variables and chaotic elements that would make Zephyrian systems behave unpredictably. The viruses were based on human thought patterns that alien computers could not process. Dr. Sophie Turner's Psychological Warfare Division had studied Zephyrian behavior and identified critical weaknesses in their mental conditioning. The aliens had never experienced mockery from their victims and had no defense against the kind of verbal abuse that humans specialized in. A coordinated campaign of insults and humiliation might be enough to break Zephyrian morale. The plan required perfect timing and incredible luck, but it was the only chance humanity had against such overwhelming force. If it failed, Earth would be destroyed. But if it succeeded, the Zephyrian Empire itself might collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. When the Imperial Armada finally arrived at Earth, they found what appeared to be empty space. The human fleet had scattered throughout the solar system using asteroid fields and planetary atmospheres to hide their signatures. Admiral Morrison waited until the Zephyrian ships had formed their traditional battle formation before beginning Operation Reverse. The first phase involved broadcasting human voices on all Zephyrian communication channels, but instead of threats or pleas for mercy, the humans began laughing. Thousands of human voices filled the alien communications network with laughter, mockery, and jokes about Zephyrian incompetence. The psychological impact on species that had never been ridiculed by their victims was devastating. Emperor Kethmore himself led the Imperial fleet and found himself listening to primitive beings making fun of his appearance, his intelligence, and his military abilities. Human comedians who had volunteered for the mission delivered insults with the skill of professional entertainers, while human children sang nursery rhymes about cowardly aliens who needed 8,000 ships to fight 200. While the Zephyrians struggled to process this unprecedented situation, human infiltration teams led by Sergeant Kevin Walsh began boarding alien ships using captured Zephyrian transport technology. Their mission was not destruction, but something the aliens had never considered possible. They would upload Parker's viruses directly into the Zephyrian command network. Walsh, as special operations units, had trained for months to use captured alien equipment and could pass for Zephyrians at a distance. They moved through the massive fleet like ghosts boarding flagship after flagship and connecting human computer systems to alien networks. Each virus upload introduced more chaos into the previously perfect Zephyrian formation. The viruses did not destroy Zephyrian systems, but made them erratic and unpredictable. Ships began receiving contradictory orders from their own computers. Weapon systems started targeting randomly selected vessels, including other Zephyrian ships. Navigation systems produced impossible course calculations that sent vessels spinning out of control. Emperor Kethmore watched in horror as his perfect fleet dissolved into chaos. Ships collided with each other as their navigation systems failed. Weapons fire erupted throughout the formation as confused computers identified friendly vessels as enemies. The most advanced military force in galactic history was destroying itself without human forces firing a single shot. Admiral Morrison chose this moment to broadcast humanity's terms to the scattered Zephyrian fleet. Complete withdrawal from all occupied systems and recognition of independence for all vassal species. The alternative was the total collapse of Zephyrian civilization as human-style unpredictability spread through their interconnected empire like a plague. The Emperor realized that his choice was between losing his empire or watching it destroy itself. The viruses were already spreading beyond the fleet to Zephyrian colonies and homeworlds as infected ships returned to base. Soon every computer system in Imperial space would be contaminated with human chaos logic that made rational planning impossible. For the first time in 3,000 years, a Zephyrian emperor admitted defeat. Kethmore broadcast his unconditional surrender to Admiral Morrison and agreed to all human demands. The mighty Zephyrian empire that had ruled the galaxy through technological supremacy was finished, not by superior weapons but by something they had never understood: the aftermath of humanity's victory transformed the entire galaxy. Former Zephyrian vassals established the Galactic Freedom Alliance with Earth as its founding member. Admiral Hayes became the first human to serve as an interspecies diplomatic coordinator, helping dozens of newly independent worlds establish peaceful relations. Dr. Katie Sullivan's research teams began working with former Zephyrian scientists to study how different forms of intelligence could coexist and complement each other. They discovered that human unpredictability combined with alien logic could solve problems that neither species could handle alone. The galaxy entered a new age where diversity of thought was valued over conformity and where technological advancement was guided by ethical principles rather than the desire for dominance. Trade replaced conquest as the primary means of interaction between species, and conflicts were resolved through negotiation rather than warfare. Captain Morrison was promoted to Admiral of the Fleet and tasked with exploring the galaxy beyond former Zephyrian space. His mission was to make peaceful contact with other civilizations and ensure that humanity's victory did not lead to a new form of imperialism. The lessons learned from defeating the Zephyrians would guide human expansion into the unknown. The final scene took place in the former imperial capital, where representatives from hundreds of species gathered to sign the Galactic Charter of Rights. Emperor Kethmore himself attended the ceremony not as a conqueror but as an equal partner in building a better future for all intelligent life. As Admiral Hayes watched former enemies working together to create a new galactic order, she reflected on how the war had begun. The Zephyrians had underestimated humanity because they judged strength by technological advancement rather than force of will. They had assumed that superior weapons would guarantee victory without understanding that determination could overcome any obstacle. The galaxy would never again make the mistake of underestimating the power of beings who refused to accept that anything was impossible. Humanity had not just won their freedom but had proven that diversity and unpredictability were strengths rather than weaknesses. The age of empires built on fear and superiority had ended, and the era of cooperation based on mutual respect had begun. The end, the Zephyrians had paid for their empire not with their lives but with their arrogance. They learned too late that underestimating humans was the most expensive mistake any species could make.